I'll be direct with you. The most foolish thing imaginable to do right now is exactly what will most likely happen. That's what decades in uniform teach you to recognize, the precise moment when a bad decision stops being reversible and turns into irreversible catastrophe. And that moment is standing right in front of us now, not as some distant possibility, but as an active probability growing stronger every single day without anyone with enough authority stepping in to say stop. I've seen wars mismanaged. I've seen politicians make military decisions that no officer with real battlefield experience would ever approve. I've seen pride, ignorance, and financial interest disguised as national strategy. But what we are witnessing now goes beyond all of that. This is not simply a bad strategy. This is the total absence of strategy, replaced by the irrational impulses of two men who will never personally pay the price for the consequences of their decisions. Nothing good has come from anything that has happened so far. Absolutely nothing. Neither the United States nor Israel has achieved a single positive objective, neither for their own interests nor for the world. And yet everything suggests the fighting is about to resume, not because there is a coherent strategy, not because any workable military plan exists, but because we have two deeply disturbed individuals in positions of power, feeding each other's delusions, while nobody with the authority or courage required is willing to stop them. I was raised, not formally, but with deep conviction, to believe that great men do not shape history, that history follows a path more like science, where structural forces, systems, and institutions determine outcomes. Maybe I was taught wrong, but what we are witnessing now completely challenges that principle. This war, in its current form, depends entirely on the personality of Donald Trump. He is not a great man, but he is a man holding enormous power at this moment in history, and that alone is enough to destroy the world order as we know it. The markets do not want this war. The oil market does not want it. Industry does not want it. The leaders of the private sector who sustain this country's economic strength do not want it. We are told that the officer corps of the US military does not want it either. And still, if war comes, it appears to rest on the feverish speculation and social media delusions of a single individual. How is that possible? That is the question every serious analyst should be asking this morning. The answer is that there are really two individuals pushing toward the abyss: Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Both are pathological liars. Both embody what psychiatrists call the dark triad of personality: narcissism, psychopathy, and megalomania. They are capable of inflicting damage and causing the deaths of thousands of people without experiencing normal human emotion or the slightest remorse. What psychiatrists describe as a shared madness amplified whenever these two interact, reinforcing one another. Israel wants this war, and they say so openly, without ambiguity. The Israeli defense minister has declared it publicly. Yes, the war must restart. Israel's dream is for the armed forces of the United States to overthrow Iran in such a way that Israel can exercise military dominance across the entire Middle East and Western Asia. That is why they are encouraging this, why they are pulling every available lever in Washington. Then there is what I call the new version of the military-industrial complex, which no longer lives in the old corridors of the Pentagon, but in Silicon Valley. That is a fundamental shift very few people still fully understand. The defense industry is no longer only companies like Lockheed, Raytheon, or General Dynamics. It now includes artificial intelligence firms, autonomous systems developers, massive data analysis companies, and surveillance technology corporations. And those companies want to test their new weapon systems under real combat conditions. They want to see how their drones perform. They want to evaluate artificial intelligence on an active battlefield, not in a laboratory simulation, because no amount of simulations can tell you what a real conflict with real targets and real human consequences will reveal. Palantir Technologies is the most visible face of this new military-industrial complex, but nearly all major technology companies are now deeply integrated with the Pentagon. At this moment, they want this war because it is profitable, but more than that, it perfects their models, strengthens future contracts, and demonstrates capabilities that otherwise would take years to validate. That is what is at stake for them, while the rest of the world pays the price in blood and instability. So why is nobody stopping this? The answer is devastating in its simplicity. The rational systems of decision-making in the United States are completely broken. We know quite a bit about how this war began on February 28th. Benjamin Netanyahu and the head of Mossad arrived and presented a story to Donald Trump. Trump was foolish enough to accept it, given his own pressures, interests, and delusions. Everyone else in that small room believed it was insanity, except Hegseth, who is an absolute idiot in his own right. The chairman of the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs showed no interest, the CIA opposed it, and even the Vice President of the United States has publicly said it is a bad idea. Rubio has been completely ineffective, with no real influence. There is no diplomacy, no interagency process, no intelligence assessments that matter, no consultation with congressional leaders, and no consideration of American public opinion, which overwhelmingly opposes everything taking place. What we have instead is a handful of people led by a delusional old man who was never particularly competent at anything and is especially terrible at this. And the Constitution of the United States states with complete clarity in Article 1 that only Congress has the authority to declare war, not the President, not the Secretary of Defense, Congress as the representative of the people. Yet most presidents have ignored that for decades, and Donald Trump violates it openly and shamelessly, while not a single member of Republican leadership in Congress says one word about it, not one word about consultation, and certainly nothing about constitutional responsibility. Congress's silence in the face of this is one of the most serious institutional abdications I have witnessed in my lifetime. For generations, we built a system of checks and balances designed precisely for moments like this, and at the exact moment we need it most, that system simply does not function. The people who should be stopping this look the other way, calculating their own political convenience, while the world moves closer to the edge. Benjamin Netanyahu is a case of his own. Beyond that, he is a deeply dark and pathological figure, a mass killer who has driven his country and the entire region down a path with no easy return. What makes all of this even more disturbing is the religious dimension behind it, something that should never be dismissed in 2026 when we are talking about two nuclear-armed countries. Two of the three leading figures in Israel are messianic zealots who read the genocidal conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua as a literal guide for what Israel should be doing today. The United States ambassador to Israel, Mr. Huckabee, openly says he agrees with that approach. This is part of the irrationality we are dealing with, not some minor detail. And now the markets are already beginning to feel what is coming. Oil is hovering around $115 per barrel. That represents at least a 50% increase from where it stood on February 27th, the day before the war began. And even that level is already causing severe economic damage around the world. But if the fighting resumes, that number will look almost nostalgic compared to what comes next. We need to understand the fundamental difference between what happened in the 1970s and what could happen now. The oil crisis of 1973 and 1979 were enormous negative shocks to the global economy, disruptions that took years to resolve and in some countries triggered debt crises lasting entire decades. But what happened then was a temporary shutdown of the tap. Painful, yes. Expensive, certainly, but temporary. What would most likely happen now, within 2 or 3 weeks of real fighting, would be the destruction of the tap itself, not merely its closure, but its physical destruction. Desalination plants, oil and gas fields, refineries, ports, pipelines, and all the civilian infrastructure connected to them. Iran has thousands of missiles and has already identified all its targets with precision. It would not take much to leave an entire region without drinkable water and electricity. Infrastructure destroyed on that scale is not rebuilt in a matter of months. We are talking about 5 to 10 years of physical reconstruction work, colossal investments, and security conditions nobody would be willing to guarantee after watching everything previously built get blown apart. And the impact would not remain confined to the Gulf. Europe is already facing serious economic difficulties. If we are talking about oil at $150 to $200 per barrel, or simply unavailable in sufficient quantities, any factory I have known in my lifetime would be forced to shut down operations. The economy as a whole would grind to a halt. Agriculture is already in crisis, partly because fertilizers depend on what passes through the Strait of Hormuz. It is not only oil, it is gas, fertilizers, minerals, and entire supply chains that would collapse simultaneously, followed by secondary financial crises. Every loan, every investment, every contract has been built on assumptions completely different from the conditions that would suddenly prevail. Massive corporate bankruptcies among companies that today appear solid. Sovereign debt costs would explode for governments already burdened with enormous debts accumulated over the past 2 decades. Currency crises, cascading banking crises, we would be talking about something not seen since World War II, something larger than any crisis we have experienced since then. Not a recession, not a financial crisis like 2008, but something qualitatively different and far deeper. Only a complete fool, only someone utterly incapable of reading a strategic map would restart combat under these conditions. And yet, that is the most likely outcome. That is the paradox we live with today. The absolute dumbest option is the one with the highest probability of becoming reality. Let me speak about something that rarely appears in Western media coverage and yet carries deep historical importance. Russia lost 27 million people defeating Adolf Hitler. 27 million. It carried the main burden of the Second World War, and that is not the opinion of an analyst, it is the historical record. China lost approximately 14 million people during the Japanese invasion. 14 million. And Western governments did not even attend the 80th anniversary of Hitler's defeat in Moscow, nor the 81st anniversary of Japan's defeat in China. The ingratitude, the absence of the most basic decency and historical understanding is genuinely disgusting. And in this context, Donald Trump said that we defeated Hitler and that Russia merely helped. That is not just ignorance. That level of stupidity becomes something cruel because of its sheer scale. What it reveals goes far beyond the ignorance of one individual. It exposes the systemic short-sightedness of our leadership, our institutions, and our political class. We are on the wrong side of history on multiple fronts simultaneously. Instead of the United States aligning itself with those who actually won the Second World War, we are supporting the aggressors of that war against the countries that were once our allies in it. My position is clear, and I make no apology for it. The United States should withdraw from both regions, and both regions should understand that their real security does not come from NATO, nor from American military bases in Japan or the Gulf, but from making peace with their neighbors. That is what genuine security means, not dependence on a foreign army that, when things become complicated, makes its own decisions without consulting anyone. I wish Japan would say, we were responsible for the deaths of 14 million people in China, and we harbor no hostility toward China. I would like to see Japan and China work together. I would like to see Germany stop entertaining revanchist fantasies, and for the German Chancellor to have the common sense to say, we bear responsibility for 27 million deaths. And the time has come for me to sit down with President Vladimir Putin and build a shared and indivisible security structure for Europe without the United States acting as the referee of our continent. Germany once had chancellors who understood that. Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, and Helmut Kohl understood it. Angela Merkel understood it as well, although in the end she was too weak to maintain that position under pressure from Washington. What we have now is something very different. As for Ukraine, if there is one thing I will acknowledge about Donald Trump, it is that he appears not to want a war with Russia. Whatever the reason may be, I get the impression he would prefer that war to end. The problem is that he lacks the competence, knowledge, and skill required to accomplish it. To do that properly, you would need a president capable of speaking directly to the American people over the heads of the military-industrial complex and explaining that NATO expansion was not a good idea, that alternative security arrangements exist, that Russia is not going to invade Western Europe, and that just as the United States considered it a cause for war when the Soviet Union attempted to establish a base in Cuba, Russia has the right to view military expansion toward its borders in the same way. It is an argument that any person with strategic training can articulate. Trump is incapable of articulating it, and nobody around him is capable of writing it for him and putting it on the teleprompter. President Vladimir Putin said this clearly in an interview he gave to Le Figaro in 2017. He said he had dealt with 3 American presidents who arrived with ideas, but then men in dark suits carrying briefcases would come in and explain how things really worked, and after that, those ideas were never heard again. That is exactly what is happening now. The system is the military-industrial complex. Individuals change, but the system remains. Europe has surprised me with its enthusiasm for deepening this conflict in a way that is economically suicidal and potentially suicidal from a military perspective as well. There is also the Russophobia in United Kingdom, which has a history going back 180 years to Viscount Palmerston and the 19th century, to the construction of fear surrounding Russian power, supposedly threatening the British Empire from Central Asia, the legend of the Great Game. And that Russophobia has survived to this day without any substantial reason. I have read academic studies documenting how in 1815 Britain and Russia were allies against Napoleon Bonaparte, and only 25 years later Britain had become fiercely Russophobic, despite Russia having done nothing to justify it. The historian's conclusion was that it had been invented, fabricated, and that fabrication continues to govern decisions in London 180 years later. This is where we have arrived. We have no rational leadership, no rational process, neither in the United States nor in Israel. We have 2 individuals with pathological traits, backed by lobbies and interests that profit from conflict, operating without the institutional restraints that should exist at a moment when the world cannot afford another miscalculation. I must conclude with what I believe the facts demand be said clearly and without euphemism. If fighting resumes in the Gulf, what follows will have no precedent since World War II. We are not talking about a temporary shock to the oil supply. We are not talking about a geopolitical crisis that time and diplomacy can resolve in a few months. We are talking about the destruction of the very infrastructure on which the global economy rests, a wound in the international system that could take a decade to heal if it heals at all, and that would cause suffering on a massive scale for hundreds of millions of people who have absolutely nothing to do with the ambitions of the 2 individuals pushing the world toward this outcome. And all of that essentially driven by the decision of a single person, made without institutional process, without consultation, without the support of his own closest advisors, without the backing of public opinion in his own country, which overwhelmingly opposes this war, and against the interests of practically everyone except those who manufacture weapon systems and those who dream of redrawing the map of the Middle East from an office in Tel Aviv. There is something strange and deeply unfortunate about being alive at this moment, but here we are, and what happens in the coming weeks will determine whether the world we know continues functioning, or whether we enter a period of darkness whose depth and duration nobody can predict with certainty. History will record who made these decisions, and it will also record that those who had the experience, knowledge, and responsibility to warn about it did so, that the warning signs were there, that there was no shortage of voices telling the truth. What was missing was someone in the right place, with the right power, willing to listen. Perhaps we will not live much longer to regret it, but while we are still here, the obligation is to say it.